Hi everyone, Joseph Kohm here with just a quick heads up at the top of this episode. Grace and I recorded this episode some time ago, and there's been some developments in the story since then. We want to let you know that since we recorded this episode, President Trump has indeed signed the executive order we refer to that requires the dismantling of the Department of Education. We still think this show has a lot of value to you. We recorded this show with the purpose of discussing what the impacts would be of the dismantling of the Department of Education. So we think it's still a good show. We hope you enjoy it. We hope it blesses you. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to House to Home, a podcast by Family Policy Alliance Foundation. I'm Grace Youngson, and today I'm joined from the FPAF team by our policy director, Joseph Kohm. Today, we're going to be talking about potentially what could be the end of the U.S. Department of Education. Joseph, why don't you take us through the story?
Love to, Grace. Thanks for being on with me today. So our story for this week comes from the Daily Wire. Dateline is March 11th, 2025. And the headline is Education Department staff expected to be slashed by half as Trump mulls closing it. So the article goes on to read that the Education Department staff have been told not to come into work as speculation swirls about whether President Donald Trump will shutter the department. All offices will be temporarily closed for, quote, security reasons, end quote. And staff are instructed to take their laptops home with them and leave their office building at 6 p.m., according to a memo sent to all Education Department employees. And this is happening as the memo to the staff comes out as the Trump administration is mulling shutting down the department entirely, which our audience has probably heard of, and that's why we want to cover this story. Last week there was a draft of a potential executive order closing the department that circulated, and I'll finish summarizing the story by just saying that drafted executive order would direct the Education Secretary Lyndon McMahon to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Education Department to maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law. So this is a dramatic development, Grace, with a lot to come and a lot of implications. But tell me, from the Daily Wire there, what is your first reaction to that story?
In the name, it's supposed to support education, and as we're going to get into in a little bit, it really doesn't do that. And so in many ways, I think this has been a long time coming, and now we're starting to see something happen.
Yeah, we are indeed going to talk more about that. So I think our audience will find that that's a very reasonable and appropriate reaction from you, Grace, as I think is mine, which is similar, I think, because of what we're going to talk about. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that this could be the single most important thing President Trump ever does over the course of both of his terms as president. If he successfully can close down the Department of Education, I think that will be the most positive, forward-facing, it will have the most positive, forward-looking impact of anything he does. And it's not hyperbolic to say that. So let's talk about why. I think I'll start, Grace, by just giving some basic info to our audience here. So the Department of Education, I think everybody's heard of, but we want to be clear that it's one of the largest departments in the federal government. It's an executive branch department, and its budget is $280 billion, all taxpayer dollars. But what's important to note for what we're going to talk about right out of the gate is that only 25% of that budget goes towards actually educating children across this country. The other roughly $220 billion goes towards the federal bureaucracy, contractors, consultants, etc., and who then those contractors and consultants then donate that money back to politicians, mostly to the Democratic Party and to teachers' unions. So I think that's shocking enough to our audience, Grace. You said the Department of Education is no longer about education. I mean, the simple financials seem to show it right there.
Yeah, I think that is evidence enough in and of itself. I mean, when you have a department that is set up supposedly for education, but only 25% of the money is actually going into that, and I just think that is a huge problem. And from a standpoint of it being more of a bureaucracy, I think that's really, really anti-American. America is supposed to be a constitutional republic. And so it is supposed to be about the people's voice and the voice of the Constitution, which we adopted, or I'm British, but Americans adopted into law. And so I think this really is Yeah, I think it's a long time coming, and as you said, I think this would be huge if Trump was to get rid of it. And I think it's interesting because another thing to note is that some of the highest donors to the Democrat Party are actually the teachers' unions themselves, who use their massive influence to ensure that the DOE peddles every woke ideology you can imagine: gender ideology, social emotional learning, DEI, revisionist history like anti colonialism. So, really, this has become a tool, a system for just indoctrinating kids with ideology that's also anti-American, but is anti-family values, is anti-biblical values. And I think the worst part about it is that taxpayers' money is funding it currently.
Yes, indeed. That indoctrination, Grace, has been happening for generations. I mean, some of our listeners will remember that back when George W. Bush was president at the turn of the century, turn of the millennia, this was a Republican priority back then to try to close the DOE, but nobody could figure out how to do it, or nobody, more accurately, had the courage to do it. So President Trump and his administration finally want to do this. I think the some incredible journalists like Christopher Rufo, some of our audience might have heard of, have done an excellent work to really make this issue front and center in the culture, at least on the conservative side of the aisle, and when it comes to prospective policies for this new administration. And it seems to fit nicely within this mandate that President Trump seems to have to cut out waste, fraud, and abuse within the federal government. We hear a lot about the work that DOJ is doing right now. Some good, some maybe needs to be revised, but that's going on. This seems to fit right in with that. So that indoctrination seems to happen through this symbiotic relationship that the DOE bureaucracy has with our teachers unions, which the teachers unions are incredibly influential. But when you see this, when you understand the symbiotic relationship, it has a strong appearance of corruption. And I think COVID really taught the American people that teachers unions don't care about students. They only care about teachers. I mean, Randy Weingarten, as the leader of the teachers unions, worked overtime to ensure that the union members she represented did not have to go back into school to actually do their jobs, to teach kids, which is ultimately how a union is supposed to function, right? The union bosses are supposed to get whatever they can for their workers for the least amount of trade off, the least amount of labor. And that can be beneficial when it comes to private unions. But public sector unions are different. That's what teachers unions are, in that, at least in private sector unions, Grace, I mean, those unions, when they strike, they're striking against the consumer for a better bargain, which, at least in theory, you can understand how that would work, and it leads to collective bargaining. But the fundamental problem I see with public sector unions like teachers unions is that when they strike, they're striking against the taxpayer, who, for most families in this country, there's no one else they can go to educate their kids. I wish private school was an option for everyone. We're trying to achieve that eventually here at FPAF, but it's just not. So this web of a strong appearance of corruption is really concerning, and I think is part of what's driving the desire to close the department.
Yeah, yeah, and I think something else that we had talked about earlier when we were talking about this is just the angle of parental rights when it comes to this, you know. I think that God's design, and definitely what we promote here at FPAF, is that for that to be, you know, parents instruct the education of their children, and God has given them that responsibility and that privilege. And I think that things are bound to get messy when we stray away from enabling parents to do that, and we pass it off to the state. We come away from God's design. And so really, I think what we're hopefully starting to see is a return to God's design. And you know, that doesn't necessarily have to be that you homeschool your children, although that can be an amazing option. It just means that parents are having a much bigger say in their child's education, rather than this being controlled by some bureaucracy of people who don't really care about kids. And so I think that's another really important point to bring out.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Grace. I think the original and God's original design for both the family and for larger society, because families are the little platoons, as we know, that make up society, is that parents have the right and the responsibility to direct the upbringing of their children. That includes a responsibility for their education. And when so little of the Department of Education is actually going towards educating kids to actually teaching and benefiting students, it's a reminder of the importance of that responsibility and why we see parents really stepping out to try to take that responsibility back, to refuse to simply co-parent with the government for 8 hours a day while their kids are in public school, and to make sure even if their kids do go to public school, like most do, at the end of the day, the parents themselves are still the ones responsible. I mean, we didn't have a Department of Education for most of this country's existence. And even public school, the idea of public schooling itself is not very old, not for this country or for the world historically. I mean, until really just about a little over 100 years ago, most education was done at the behest of parents and maybe in certain circumstances, small communities. Grace, I know you have some experience with this, or at least you recognize this, but I think this, even if we maintain a Department of Education and a public school system, I think the state's objective should be to partner with parents to help them take that responsibility for their kids' education. And whatever happens to DOE, that's what I hope is the result.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I actually was homeschooled, although I went to a Christian school for a while until I was about 12 years old, and then I was homeschooled, and um, I would like to think that turned out okay, but I'm super grateful for not having been exposed to all this harmful ideology. I think it also meant that when I did come up against that, because many people would like to make the argument of, oh, your child is going to be weak when they actually get exposed to the real world. And for me, it was the exact opposite. My beliefs were so deeply rooted in me that I could see the wood from the trees kind of thing. And I was able to stand firm in those beliefs. And I think that that's just a testament to that healthy family structure, to the parents, because parents are the ones who really care about their kids. The state doesn't really care about kids. And so I think as we empower parents more and more, we're also going to see healthier kids, smarter kids, and just more thriving. Our society is going to thrive more as a whole. So I think that as we as we just empower parents more, the results can only be positive.
Yeah, that's well said, Grace. For the record, I think you're an excellent representation of a good homeschool product. So well done to you and to your folks. Kind of this idea of parents taking responsibility for their kids' education. I mean, if people want an easy historical reference for this, I think we both grew up watching Little House on the Prairie on TV. We can all think about
Yes.
Laura and Mary walking to school at the local church house and having class with all the rest of the kids from their town there. That's not to say the church, educated all the kids, but usually the church was one of those institutions, along with the state, that empowered parents to exercise that responsibility over their kids' education to ensure they were brought up well. And in that shown in those great stories by Laura Ingalls Wilder, you just see the church supporting that mission by lending its schoolhouse um, to all the kids from the community so they could have one place to gather safely and learn. So I think it's important here just to end this session, Grace. I just want to add the caveat that yes, we think these ideologies like gender ideology, DEI, critical race theory, we think these all are harmful. We're not advocating for a suppression of speech and education through this. What we're advocating for is that these ideologies not be taught by law as the way for people to think. Part of education is learning how to think, not what to think. And when the state colludes with a union and colludes with workers through a hierarchical system that they have a monopoly over to push only one way to think, that is concerning, and it definitely affects the parents' right responsibility to direct their kids' education. So with that, Grace, I think we should move on to the next section of this show, which is what would the other side say? As our audience knows, we like to give the other side their chance to be heard here, and we really work hard to summarize what we think they would say. So Grace, how about you take a turn this time to just tell us what you think the other side would say here, maybe summarize their argument, and I'll add any color if I want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think they would say, the Department of Education provides essential education services and standards to children and school districts across the nation. Without them, our education system would plummet, and worse, the money going to public school districts and teachers' unions around the country will now likely be directed towards school choice. And then education would flounder in America because of this. Don't you care about education? And how would you respond to that, Joseph?
Yeah, that's a good summary, especially the last bit there is don't you care about education? I hear that a lot in the debate about the DOE these days. And the answer is, of course we do. We wouldn't even be doing the show, and we certainly wouldn't be doing what we do at FPAF. So um but I understand where the emotion comes from. You attack a department called the Department of Education. Well, what could be so bad about that? Well, that's what we're talking about with this show is how the Department of Education, not as an entity, may or may not be good or bad, but certainly how it's been hijacked for ill, I think. So to respond to that argument, I think there's a couple of key points to consider. One is something we've mentioned briefly already, which is the department's finances. Just simply looking over the department's finances shows that it actually provides very little tangible support to students. Most of the money you see actually serving students at public schools throughout our country comes from your state taxes, because these schools are usually run in partnership with a state Department of Education as well. Plus, the Trump administration has already promised that their rollbacks of this department will not affect student application for federal financial aid. Many people listening will be responsible to the federal government for giving them the loans that they were able to even go to college for. And that's a good thing. And the Trump administration, at least publicly, has said that they recognize this, and that this, whatever they do at the department will not affect that. Even if the department is closed, the way I see this working, Grace, is that the student aids, the sub departments of the Department of Education that handle federal applications for financial student aid will simply be rolled into another federal government department if the DOE closes completely.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Joseph, and it's just we're once again just re-emphasizing what we said about finances, and I think that you know um there isn't the argument against school choice. Actually, about half of the United States has passed school choice laws enabling parents to better choose the educational environment that's right for their child. So this is not a controversial issue in that sense. Parents tax dollars should be going to where how they want their children educated, and honestly, that's just common sense. I think that overall, when it comes to tax dollars, no one wants their tax dollars spent in a way that doesn't align with their values. And so I think that a lot of these arguments are just empty at the end of the day when you actually take a deeper dive into them. Um, I don't know if you have any more comments, Joseph.
No, I think that's a really important point, Grace, which is the school choice point. I mean, that was one of I mean, the reason we put this in the summary of the other side's argument is because Randy Weingarten has said this publicly, that it would be awful if the money that could flow through the Department of Education were simply redirected towards school choice programs. And maybe from her perspective, I can see how that might not be good for the teachers union she represents, but would be excellent for the American family. You stated earlier the government really doesn't care about kids. We think the evidence shows that that is true, and where we sit right now with the 2025 Federal Department of Education. Even if it were true in theory that the federal government did care a lot about kids, and there's a scenario where that could be really true, that would be not immaterial, but certainly less important to the fact that parents know their kids best. There's nobody who understands an individual child better than that child's parents, which is part of the reason we vest parents with such broad and crucial rights, that right to direct their education and take responsibility for it. So this is where school choice is so important, I think. I think we believe at FPAF, which is that in theory, and this is why this policy is so popular. School choice is wildly popular across the political spectrum. The theory is very simple, very intuitive, and very morally upright, I think, which is simply that each parent's tax dollars that go towards education should go to their kids' education. Their money should follow their kids for the educational environment that those parents know is right for their kids because they know their kids best. So whether that's public school, whether it's private school, whether it's a parochial school, maybe a charter school. Those parents should have the right to send their tax dollars to whichever of those environments they believe is best for their kids. I think it's very difficult to argue, Grace. I've seen people try to argue this in state legislatures, and they've lost every time, which is why more and more states are passing this, and why school choice ultimately doesn't threaten small local schools. You hear that objection sometimes from the conservative side of the aisles that this whole town is built around a local public school and our Friday night lights. Well, this actually won't threaten that if that's the only school in your region, and also it would be good for that school because it applies a market perspective to the education environment for kids. It means if there's now more competition for the public schools who have had up till recently no competition in America since they were established, then it means they'll have to compete too to provide a good education for their kids. And that benefits everybody, students across the board at every school, that increase the competition level. So I find that really helpful. And Grace, maybe I'll just say finally about the standards the DOE professes, because that was part of our alternative argument. The DOE puts out critical standards. I think that's kind of also belied by some of the metrics about our learning standards in America and our learning outcomes, which is we're not one of the world's leaders in this, unfortunately. America should be leading the world in something like education, and we're not. So whatever standards the DOE is espousing, they're not seeming to work.
I totally agree with you, Joseph. I think you summed that up really well.
I appreciate that. So hopefully that competition that I mentioned will actually help increase those standards across the board and return us to a federalist perspective on education. So I think that was a good response to the opposing argument. I mean, listeners can make up their own mind, but I think we've tried to give you both sides of the story here in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do you have any other last comments, Joseph?
I think I'm good, Grace. So maybe we'll wrap up here. Just want to thank our audience for tuning in to listen to this episode of House to Home, which is a podcast of Family Policy Alliance Foundation. I've been Joseph Kohm, as always. I've been alongside Grace Youngson on our team. We're here every week on FPAF. You can find the latest episode wherever you get your podcasts, and you can connect with FPAF on social media. Our social media handles will be in the show notes and the episode description. So thank you for listening. We'll see you again next week.